across the Spotsylvania courthouse battlefield. And we're also going to take kind of a slice out of the story of the Spotsylvania courthouse battlefield. We're going to be looking at various aspects of it. We're going to be looking at pieces of the battle, pieces of the battlefield, and we're going to be looking at memory and how it impacts the way we look and interact with these things and how we interact with each other. So this is a very contemplative walk that I want to spend a little bit of time talking, but a lot of time walking and thinking about where we are, what has transpired, and what it means to you, how it relates to you. Okay? So, we are going to cover 2 miles of this battlefield in our walk today. We're going to be looking at some of the highlight spots that you might be familiar with, but we're also going to be talking about some of the things that you might not have been familiar with as we go along. And we'll that slice through here. You were walking part of it, you'll walk a part of it again, but you can actually see a piece of it that was untouched. So you want to know what a lane would have looked like back in the 1860s. Now you get a sense of its width and its depth, with the idea of how much activity has gone back and forth on this, how much has been etched by wagons in this low ground, which is pretty soft, still soft today. So a lot of activity here in 1864. The Battle of Spotsylvania is a little different than just most every battlefield that you've probably encountered, because it doesn't have one white heat moment. It is a perpetual conflict that goes on day by day, hour by hour, sometimes intensifies to a white heat that men had not known before, like the Bloody Angle. But it also is perpetual sniping, perpetual contact. This isn't what we saw in 1861 or 1862 or 1863. So we're looking at a whole different type of warfare here. Why has everything changed in 1864? Why is it this year that we see this type of warfare suddenly emerge?
We decided to do earthworks like they haven't before.
Earthworks are going to have a big impact on how the fighting is going to happen. What else is going on in the world?
We had Grant in charge.
Grant in charge, and I also heard the election.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The 1864 presidential election is going to be one of the big pushes for everything that we do on this battlefield. Everything that you see, every action that occurs, is going to have a political overtone to it. So what are the stakes in a presidential election in 1864?
Could have McClellan.
You got McClellan? So the Democratic candidate? Interesting that we started with McClellan. We didn't start with Lincoln. So we started with McClellan. Who is McClellan?
Former general.
The former general of the Army of the Potomac, former commander of all armies at one point, the successor of Winfield Scott, considered in 1862 to be America's military genius, the young Napoleon, which is about as high an accolade as Americans can give to a soldier in the 19th century. How does the public feel about him in 1864?
He's on the peace plank.
Not very popular.
Not very popular, I'm hearing. I'm hearing that he's on a peace plank. So if he's not very popular, why would the Democrats run him?
Tired of war.
He's a recognizable name, maybe.
He's recognized. And in fact, he has a huge following. There are numerous people that admire him. There are a lot of people back home that still believe that he is a military gifted person, if not a military genius. And they weigh his professional opinion on a war against a president who's been waging war through his entire first administration. Does Abraham Lincoln have a military background?
No. Well, I mean the Black
War.
Hawk War.
Black Hawk War? Yeah, he was a militia officer who literally found himself so in over his head that he created an unusual order where he couldn't figure out how to get his garrison off the parade ground and out of the fort.
steps of Emory Upton's attack. So we're going to kind of back things up and talk about, as Frank had mentioned, a little bit of how we get ourselves here. Before I go too far, can everybody hear me at this volume in the back? Y'all good? I don't want to hurt anybody in the front row, but I can. If I get too soft, just say something and I can speak up a lot louder.
The man with the hearing aid says he can hear you.
Oh, right. That's what I need to know. All right. So my first question for you all, since Frank has warmed up the crowd a little bit with other questions, is to ask kind of a really big picture question and ask you all who you think, whether it be historically or today, who in our world has the power to make change?
And anyone?
Just going straight for the idealistic beliefs
The electorate.
here. The electorate. Tell me more about that.
The Constitution says, gives us that power.
All right, so the Constitution gives us that power. So as people who can vote, which changes through time, doesn't it? In interesting ways, those folks have power to make change by voting. Please vote, everybody.
Right now, not necessarily landowners, but most of them have to have property.
All right, so in some cases, depending on what state you're in, property owning men, if we're talking historically. So right now, and his goal is to then find a weak point to turn Lee out of his lines. And how do we do that, knowing that Lee has these earthworks that can be a force multiplier, that make it harder to be overwhelmed, even if his earthworks, again, are not perfectly designed? Because, as you all in this kind of arch shape for us, if you're trying to defend your position, your fire is going to be scattered in multiple directions as you're looking out, but you can be attacked and sort of surrounded much more easily. So you have a weak-ish line. So you strengthen it. You build it up with artillery, you put slashings down out front like Frank was talking about, but there's still opportunities. And the members of the 6th Corps in particular are going to sit down and start talking about what are their options. How can they maybe make something out of this opportunity that Frank had already talked about and kind of teed up to say, hey, there might be an option here. And we often put this on 24-year-old Emory Upton for suggesting the attack. And the thing is, he may have suggested the attack, but it really takes a village to make this attack right. So, oh no, I said right, and now I'm about to talk about Horatio Wright, who is one of the commanders of the 6th Corps. And Horatio Wright and David Russell, so kind of the next levels of command, are really the ones who dig into the planning of this attack, and they form up the whole attack for Upton to then lead. They plan a bayonet attack. Why plan a bayonet attack?
Because you're charging the earthworks.
Yeah, so you can charge. I heard something about firing.
Don't stop. Yeah, you won't stop and fire. You keep on momentum, push you forward.
Right, so you're not going to stop and fire because you're attacking an entrenched position, right? So if you stop and fire, where are all the bullets going to go?
You.
Yeah, you're going to be standing there as an open target, and you're going to be firing at targets you can't see. So the best idea for them is to form a really compact line and try to punch through the lines with a bayonet attack. And that's what they do. They're focusing on efficiency. They attack in a column. They punch through the lines. They come up real close to the Confederates. They push forward. They punch through the lines. This is an immediate success.
Question.
Yeah.
Were they running up from the woods or were they marching quickly up the woods?
I believe they were running. Okay. Yeah, because you got a bayonet charge. You do not want to take your time with that.
Right.
And it's open ground.
And it's open ground. You're just a target.
Were they able to actually form up in the woods before they began the charge? I mean, that's a short distance.
They do, yeah. So if you see, if you saw the wayside sign that we passed on our way up, that's about the point where they kind of stop and form up. I mean, it's probably not the most perfect lines of battle that you'll ever see because of the woods, but they are able to form up in a line. I mean, it's not the long line of battle that you'd see traditionally. They're packing a punch, so they have the lines more in depth.
How far across were they?
That's a good question that I can't answer for you.
Oh, okay.
Ultimately, again, while it's ultimately very successful initially, they break through the lines, they start to develop that breakthrough, the other lines start to come forward and exploit that space. ultimately it's doomed by a lack of support and misunderstandings with these other officers who were supposed to attack at the same time. The failure of these other attacks means that the 6th Corps, the rest of their support, is ordered not to support them, and Upton gets ordered back to pull back to the lines. Even though his success was realized, again, the support ordered, but it's already too late. Upton ends up having to retreat. The losses were about 1,000 casualties, but he captured about 950 prisoners as estimated by the provost. So, interestingly successful based on the trench attack. Yes.
But it also ended in disaster. Did it save lives? Or did it cost thousands of lives? So if you're a grad, is this something that we try to tweak, or is this something we try to abandon? Tweak it, okay. So you're telling me that there's some merit to that. It's better than Fredericksburg is what I'm hearing. Yes. Okay, so we're gonna set the gold standard at Fredericksburg. We're doing great. So we're in good shape here, everybody. So they are gonna tweak it. They're gonna make another attack. They're gonna do it 2 days later on May 12th. It's gonna hit the very tip of the Mule Shoe, which is about 9/10 of a mile straight behind you. How did that attack go?
Started great.
I'm hearing started great. I think there's some interesting words there. Started great. I didn't hear great. In fact, the Union troops do penetrate the center of the line. They made the entire Mule Shoe untenable. Confederates had to abandon a significant portion of their line, and they had to erect a new line. The center of their line, when it disappeared, no longer has a Mule Shoe. It has 2 dangling wings with the Federals in between.
Thanks for joining us on this long hike, and especially right now for sticking around past the advertised time. I promise that I'll wrap things up fairly quickly, but I do want to have some sort of pause for us all to kind of come together and reflect a little bit on the things that we've heard this morning, but also for those of us, which I know is many of you who've been with us for the whole weekend, to kind of reflect and think about what all of this represents. So I want to step away for a minute from the troop movements and talking specifically about where we are on the map, or whose division was moving where at what time, and just to think for a minute about all of the horrific and indescribable violence that we have been following throughout this weekend. And I know a lot of you to Pennsylvania, and he visits this battlefield a year later, and he came upon a dead soldier from fighting that happened later in the battle. One from his very division and corps, so this is someone that he might have felt particularly connected to. And he talks about this as though he sees all of his comrades represented in this space. And he talks about this one man, though, and he says no one had seen him fall. No one knew his fate, and so in the list of casualties reported after the battle, another soldier was simply missing. Who can tell of the weary waiting and watching and waiting of the loved and loving ones at home for the tidings of the absent soldier boy? But could those loving ones have stood by his side on that beautiful May day, as I did, they would have been comforted by the thought that God knows each hero's grave and he will not forget. Neither had he forgotten this one, but, as if anticipating the beautiful ceremony of our Memorial Day, had literally surrounded the resting place of this unknown hero with the greatest profusion of beautiful flowers.
It's like 23,000 casualties. The Letterman system is in effect to care for those wounded. But then Letterman resigns. He resigns in January of 1864. His kind of mentor is under political pressure from Congress, and so Letterman, in solidarity, resigns from the post. And so on the eve of the Army of the Potomac's biggest challenge, the Overland campaign, Letterman is killed. He is replaced by a man named Thomas McFarland, who has to very quickly catch up to speed and realize kind of what's going to happen, right?
This was the epicenter of Sanitary Commission activity. So the reason that Abby and her, fellow nurses are staying just down the road at Scotia is because their main warehouse was on William Street. We just passed it. Ryan has kind of an image that he can show of William Street taken at that time in May of 1864. There was a confectionery store owned by a guy named Edward Heineken, and that's the building that they use, and they put their flag out on the front of it. So if you look at this image or pull it up on Library of Congress, you see the Sanitary Commission flag out front.
How did they get into these buildings? Did the people just let them come in, or did they have to just commandeer them? Or
some of them, being vacant, they're able to move
they were already
into
vacant?
them. At least for Scotia, we know Frances Scott is still there, so I'm sure they had to kind of talk back and forth with her to stay there. But
Yeah, 'cause
mostly
they let the
they're
Yankee Devils come
moving
in.
into vacant buildings, public buildings a lot,
Okay.
churches, courthouse. And so with the Sanitary Commission kind of getting all of its supplies from William Street here, this is where all these relief workers come, and then from here they spread out amongst all of the different hospitals that are organized down to the division level. So a division of a certain corps, that's the hospital that certain patients are going to go to based on where they were in the Army. So behind their warehouses was their diet kitchen. So this is where they're preparing all of the food that they're going to give to soldiers and spread out amongst the hospitals. The person who's credited as kind of leading this organization, and everybody's noting that she's kind of in charge of it, is Arabella Barlow, Francis Barlow's wife. And so she's here working in this space, preparing meals for the wounded soldiers. A friend of Arabella wrote of her in Fredericksburg and said, "We called her the Raider." At Fredericksburg, she had in some way gained possession of a wretched-looking pony and a small cart or farmer's wagon with which she drove about town or country in search of provisions. So she's going to get what she needs. This is significant because Sanitary Commission workers here are gathered together by photographer James Gardner to take a photo in this kitchen, this space right here. And Ryan has the image here that he'll pass around and make sure everybody kind of gets a glimpse of. And so as you look at this photo, this is this group of relief workers that have been kind of asked to sit by Gardner so that he can take a picture of what they're doing in the space just beyond us behind this brick wall.
Introduce you to some of the aid workers. The next couple of stops, I want to tell you some personal stories of some of the soldiers who came here, right, as wounded patients. The building we want to talk about is the one behind many of you or in front of you. This is the Baptist Church, right? The Baptist Church here constructed in 1855, replacing a former site of the Baptist Church. It becomes technically the Field Division Hospital for the 3rd Division, 6th Corps. Any of you fans of James Ricketts' division or any of the guys who fight later at Monocacy, this is going to be their hospital, right? The hospital had already seen extensive use during the Civil War. It was used as a hospital in both 1862 and 1863. Its reverend, a man named William Brodus, had been arrested in 1862 under charges of disloyalty and was sent in the old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. So this church has kind of been through it, right? To this day, in the steeple, there's still cannonball damage, right? So it's a pretty fascinating structure. And it becomes one of these hospitals. Someone was asking a little earlier ago, how many buildings were used, right? How many structures are we talking about in this hospital, And what's important to think about, right? In 1860, the town population of Fredericksburg was 5,000 people. Based off research, we figured that about 10% of the town was destroyed during the Battle of Fredericksburg, bombarded, right? Many of the civilians of town had fled to literally anywhere not named Fredericksburg, right? So the town population is, by 1864, maybe 1,500, maybe, right? So you have a lot of vacant buildings, okay? But you still have to find place for 26,000 patients. So you're gonna stuff these buildings full to the brim. The provost marshal of the army is a guy named Our Patrick. He does come here and he does put armed guards on private property. And we'll get into that a little bit later, right? So it's not like every house is a free-for-all. Churches, those are gonna be used pretty quickly, right?
What comes next? So where Ryan left us when we were at the Citizens Hall site was a very impactful, profound story of one soldier who was remembered by the person who was caring for him. A person with a family, with a life outside of this place here in Fredericksburg. And so what happens to all of the people like that soldier who did not survive their wounds here in Fredericksburg? And what happens to all of these relief workers who have gathered here in Fredericksburg from far off places? Where do they go next? So with all of the thousands of soldiers that are here in Fredericksburg who do not survive their wounds, that gives these relief workers another very difficult, very emotionally taxing job to do. Because before they leave this place, they want to make sure that all of these soldiers that they have spent time meeting and learning their names and learning where they were from, that they get a final resting place. And so these relief workers spend about the 2-week period that they are here in Fredericksburg working in the hospitals, but also coordinating the burials. And just imagine what that process was like. And so in 1864, we've talked about the photographers that are here. If you went to the Brompton program, you learned about some of the different photographers and companies that were in this area in 1864 that came to capture this moment in time. They capture Sanitary Commission workers, you know, over at their diet kitchen over here off of William Street. They also gather a series of images further north in town of burial details and crews out actually doing the work of burying these soldiers. And if you look at those images, you'll see a host of different people. You'll see civilians based on their dress. U.S. soldiers are there coordinating the burials, religious leaders. You'll also see formerly enslaved people helping with the burial process. Abby and Sally wrote that as they came into Fredericksburg, enslaved people were flocking to the lines, but they didn't stop there. They also started working in the hospitals and working on moving wagons between places. And so this is a difficult but extremely important job. I therefore made application to the Provost Marshal for authority to officiate at the burial of those soldiers who were to be buried within the military limits of the city. I've officiated up to present time at the burial of 133 officers and privates. No proper headboards or coffins are provided, but we use shingles with the names written thereon and placed at the heads of the dead as carefully as possible so that friends can readily find the bodies of those they seek. And Ryan shared with us some of the complications that eventually arise in the post-war era of trying to locate those graves. But what we also see with this story of Reverend Stone and the leadership that he takes to fill a need is that there's an importance of maintaining identity here. The Overland campaign is dealing with thousands of soldiers, thousands of casualties, and this long series of battles that go on and on. And within this, you see stories of people trying to remember the people around them, who they were, making sure that that record would be left behind. And so even though we don't know the names of all of the relief workers that were here in Fredericksburg, today we just shared a couple of them with you, and the research is ongoing. We're trying to find more of them. And while we don't know the names and locations of all of the soldiers initially buried here in the town, the stories that we shared with you all today demonstrate that people were seeking human connection during this tragedy. They're seeking someone that's going to learn who they are, who's going to be a friendly face to them. The wilderness in Spotsylvania Courthouse resulted in thousands of casualties, and sometimes we kind of get in the habit for, if we're Civil War buffs, to kind of compare battles based on the casualty counts. But each person has a name, they had a home, they had an identity. And so Reverend Stone's story of trying to mark these burials for these people's loved ones reminds us to look beyond the numbers, but also to look forward. He wasn't just interested in getting the job done here in May of 1864 so that he can move on. He's also interested in what is going to come next, and he takes note of that and reminds us that that is important to do, to think about what the next step is. And so what the next step is for a lot of these people is to just move to the next battlefield.
Thank you for watching our video. Please consider liking it and subscribing to the channel. And if you have any suggestions for future videos, please leave those in the comment section. We'll work on getting them out to you as soon as possible.